Savoie. Originally born and raised in Louisiana, very, very extreme Louisiana. About an hour from the nearest grocery store on the Gulf of Mexico, not too far from Texas. You have to drive 30 miles on a levee through the marsh to reach where I grew up. Our high school was about this size, 350 students was my high school. And my family, my grandparents never spoke English, only Cajun French. My mother never spoke English until she started school. My grandparents never spoke English except for one until they died. So growing up, I would speak a little bit of Cajun patois with them, and they would try to understand me, and I try to understand them. A lot of sign language, pointing and gestures. We lived off the land. We all hunted alligator, we crawfished, we ate and hunted turtle. We would go frog gating, we would shrimp, we would oyster, we would duck hunt. We were big duck hunters. My dad was the only gunsmith in southwest Louisiana, so I grew up hunting ducks and geese and all that stuff. I also was a fur trapper. I used to trap fur with my grandparents and sell the hide for money in the fall, the late fall. So that was my life growing up. And so with all of that, of course, everything is connected to nature and the earth and all that the world provides. It was kind of a normal thing for me anyway, my thinking process, that I wanted to be a veterinarian. And so when I graduated high school, that's what I went towards. So I started studying to be a veterinarian, and I ended up working at 2 different vet clinics and a horse cutting stable. And while all that was unfolding, that's when my life started to turn around and at the same time upside down. Eventually, long story, very long story made short, I entered seminary. I studied for seminary and graduated minor seminary in Covington, Louisiana, at St. Joseph's Abbey with the Benedictine monks. And while I was there, towards the end, all my friends with the Diocese of Lake Charles, Louisiana, where I was originally from, they were all quitting. And I was kind of me by myself. And so I had another crisis of faith at that point, and I decided that I needed to move. I wanted to go, and I don't know why this occurred, but somehow God's hand, they say God writes straight with crooked lines. So whether I made a perfect decision or not, I decided to move. Another very long story made short, I moved to Alabama. I was one of my mentor brother seminarians was Paul Zogby, now Father Paul Zogby, and he was one of the reasons why I moved here. And so my very first thing was Archbishop Lipscomb. Before Archbishop Brody, he assigned me with a job, because I wasn't yet ready to go to seminary. It was January, and seminary didn't start till August. And he was going to send me to Philadelphia to seminary. So he put me teaching at a high school, Catholic high school, McGill Tool. And I'm going to embarrass her for a second. Miss Kathleen Riley came to my rescue there, because I was only like 21 years old, and I was now teaching theology. I had no idea how to teach or make a lessons plan, so I plagiarized everything from her, so 100% of what I taught came from her for the most part, and she kept me alive that only semester I taught there. And then again, eventually I was ordained, had 7 assignments, and my last assignment is now Christ the King, and I've been there for 2 months, so I'm the new kid on the block. So with all that, let's talk about the gospel. No, I'm going to keep it very simple. The gospel gives us something, and this does relate back to my life and my childhood. The gospel gives us the 7 woes. Yesterday, and I think tomorrow's going to come with it too. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees. And he calls them hypocrites. Okay, so here's a little Q&A, a little involvement if you have the courage. What is a hypocrite in your own words? Who is brave enough to tell me what they think a hypocrite is? At least in terms of what Christ is talking about in the gospel. Anyone brave enough to answer the question? At Christ the King, I give treats for those who answer questions. Someone who doesn't practice what they preach, right? Any idea why a person would not practice what they preach? In other words, they say, you shouldn't do this, but then they excuse themselves and they allow themselves to do it. Why would someone have that kind of attitude? what goes on in a person's mind when they say, you should do it, but I don't have to? Right, they think of themselves as above others, better than others, that kind of stuff. And we see a lot of that, on display in the public arena with the politicians. They're constantly doing things like that. And that speaks badly of them and politics in general sometimes. But it's basically the rules don't apply to me because I'm above it. I don't have to do it because, and we can fill in the blanks of why that because is with all sorts of excuses. But it always comes down to the same thing. And I forget how the words exactly were on that little sign, but my grandmother, her name was Marie Boudreau. Talk about a French name. So my grandmother's name is Marie Boudreau, and she's the matriarch in my family. She died at 96 years old. And she had a sign in her house. It was in English. And I forget exactly how it was worded because I was a child, but it said something along the lines of, the world does not owe you a living. The world does not owe you a living. You have to work to get it. Something along those lines. And that's sort of that same vein of thought. The rules apply to you, but it doesn't apply to me. And it can come in all sorts of shades and colors and behavior, but a lot of it, we use a new buzzword today in today's colloquialism. We call it entitlement. People sometimes are entitled. I am above. It doesn't apply to me. I don't have to do it. So I'll give you one experience. It was a number of years ago, more than 12 years ago. My first Christmas at an assignment, St. Pius X. And when I was there, it was my first Christmas there, we had the first Mass, and of course there's the Mass Christmas Eve, all the children come, and when they left, when Mass was over, I was doing all the Masses that week. And when they left, the church was like an explosion that happened. I mean, everything was in total disarray. Every pew was messed up. All the books were messed up. There were Kleenex, dirty this, there were even Cheerios and Fruit Loops, and it was a disaster. And the church was empty. Literally, there was not another human being there. Jesus was in the tabernacle, and I was standing at a pew, and that was it. No other heartbeats in that building. And I had another Mass in 2 hours. And so I was quite flustered. It was my first Christmas there, and the church is quite large. If you've ever been to St. Pius X, it's bigger than this, quite large. And I started going up and down every pew, cleaning up, because I'm, in most areas of my life, not all areas, but in most areas I'm kind of a neat freak. And so I was cleaning up, picking up, getting rid of all the nastiness. And my blood pressure, I could feel the anger building up, especially when I started finding things like wet Cheerios and stuff like that smeared into the pew. And finally at one point, I guess it was God, the Holy Spirit, something, entered into my thinking process. And it really, it's probably related back to what someone had told me before once. Mother Teresa of Calcutta, actually. She didn't tell me, I heard her say it. That whenever we do something, we can kind of have two perspectives. I have to do it, or I want to do it. It's one of the two. And if we can look at it in terms of doing it for someone we love. You know the story of Mother Teresa of Calcutta? How many of you have ever heard of Mother Teresa of Calcutta? Okay. She's one of the greatest saints in history. Do you know what she would do when she would ride on an airplane? She had this special card. It was back in the day before 911 and before all this chaos of terrorists. She had this card, and she could fly Pan American Airlines doesn't exist anymore. She could fly Pan Am just by walking on this card. And do you know what she would do practically every time? Usually her flights were, taking her from country to country, sometimes, not often, overseas. And she was just this little 4-foot-something nun from, originally from Albania, but lived in Calcutta. Do you know what she would do on an airplane? Eventually she would get up, and she would go throughout the entire airplane. We're talking 747s, giant airplanes, 2 levels, in the front. She would clean the toilets, literally. She would get up, and she would go inside of the airplane lavatory, and she would clean it up, including the toilet. And when she would finish with that one, she would go to another one. And one time, one of the nuns who had never seen her do this before saw her get up and leave, and she didn't come back for a very long time. And she said, "Mother, what were you doing?" She said, "Exorcisms." She said that doing these things kept her humble. Because, you know, we all have to use these toilets. And so many of us expect someone else to do the cleaning. You know what? Every single one of us has the same process of eating and disposing. Every single one of us is absolutely grounded in humanity as everyone else. There isn't a single soul that God creates in a human being that is better or less than any other soul. It's impossible, because we're all equal from God. We're all mortal, he's not. And so Mother Teresa would do this constantly. And so, ironically, every seminary I've been in charge of the toilets. So my first seminary, I took over the toilets. And it was very easy because we had 80 guys living in one dorm, and I was in charge of the toilet paper. So guess who was everyone's friend, right? So all the guys really trusted me because I was going to make sure that things were right. In the end, what I did that day in the church on Christmas Eve was I reminded myself that what I'm doing, I'm actually doing for Christ. I'm cleaning up everyone's mess, but I changed the reason why I was doing it in my mind. It wasn't no longer because I'm a neat freak and I like the church clean for God. But no, now it's because I'm cleaning it for you, Jesus. Because this is your church. This is your tabernacle. This is your altar. And I'm just the priest. That's it. My goal is to provide for you what you want to give to the people. I'm that vessel. I'm that, umbilical part of your grace in this moment. And so I started cleaning up all the pews, but my whole attitude is now I'm doing it for Jesus. So in life, there's going to be many things we don't want to do. Whether it's school, parents, whatever. But most everything is about perspective. As long as it's not immoral, then it comes down to how you perceive it in your own mind. And whether it's homework, because you're trying to do what? You're trying to improve the mind that God gave you. And God gave it to you for a reason. And you have a purpose in life. And therefore that mind is important. That's an important part of it. Whether it's chores at the home, it's the same thing. We're all humanity. We're all, have the toilet. We all have the reality of cleaning up the mess that we make and helping others do their part because they help us do our part. So whether it's chores, whether it's homework, whatever it is in life, whatever we do, and no matter how often we have to do it, and no matter how unpleasant it may be, and sometimes even difficult, we're talking sweat, sometimes even blood, depending on the kind of work you do. But if we do it from the perspective that we're doing it to make God better, that is what he wants us to do, his kingdom, his people, his environment, his church, his home that we live in, calling ourselves our house, but that's called a domestic church. Your home is called the domestic church because God is alive in that environment as well. God is present. And so when Jesus points out to the Pharisees today, you hypocrites, he's just reminding us something very simple. We're all equal. Because we all are created by God with that same dignity. And that dignity is indeed invaluable. It has no value that can be placed upon it because it's from God. And so we can't look down on others, nor can we look down on ourselves. That's doing violence to God's gift every bit as much. Let us stand and bring our prayers before our Father.